From the moment in which Second World War places Americans in a very hegemonic position in the international system, one of the effects is that the US academia started to create the first great departments of international relations. It was influenced by a transformation that revolutionized all the social sciences of that period. In this, we have behavioralism, a type of understanding that was born within the area of psychology. Behavioralism seeks to show the theories based on the individuality of behavior are not objective because they do not deal with observable behavior. Those theories deal with the capacity for self-observation or its ability to discern the individual's specific trajectory, and they are not measurable. They don't work for everyone in the same way. Behavioralism seeks to build an understanding of behavior by looking at the relationship between stimulus and response. It is based on observable variables. Here we look at behavior conditioning that begins with research about animals. Pavlov brings up the question of the nature of association. He was a Russian physiologist concerned with the digestive processes of animals. The researcher had an assistant who was responsible for feeding the animals. At one point, Pavlov notices that when the assistant enters the room, the animals immediately begin to salivate. Thus, the researcher realizes that when the assistant enters the room, the animals have created an association between the assistant and food. Skinner uses this to say that we can train animals and people. With therapy, we train people to do things, teaching them to do certain processes or dissociate from them. Skinner tried to show through his experiments with rats how to look for food in ways that no one had taught them to do before. The rat at some point would press the lever and the food would come out. In this way, it would create a stimulus producing the same association that the dog made. This allowed him to create an observation between artificially introducing a stimulus and getting a response that can be reinforced by conditioning. This is interesting because you can teach or unteach them to do things. Even if we teach the rat to eat in this way, once we remove this mechanism, it will no longer make this association. Thus, we understand that it is possible to condition behavior. Morgenthau and Carr propose that we must know the history of certain systems to understand the dynamics of decision-making. In this, we will be able to discern which decision patterns will lead us to effective behavior and which decision patterns will lead us to behavior that leads to more damage. The objective of the classical authors is to understand which is the knowledge tradition that allows me to understand a system's dynamics and what is at stake in the decision. This decision is subjective in nature because it is guided by the principles by which I want to build an international system. Do I want to give stability to the international system, or do I want to revolutionize it around the world community? Here we have knowledge that is not generalizable. It is conditioned by the historical circumstances of the system and by the political ethical principles through which you analyze what is at stake in the decision. Here behavioralism seeks to change the vocabulary itself. We are not talking about decisions. We are talking about behavior because it is observable. The decision is a gamble on an uncertain future. Behavior is observable. This is the problem that arises in the 20th century. We have a type of knowledge that looks to history to understand the dynamics of the system and the principles of decision. The problem with this is that with this knowledge, it is not possible to produce a theory of international relations that is general. With a general theory, it will be possible to understand all international systems, regardless of historical context, regardless of geography, and to evaluate that theory that is empirically observable. The science model that starts to emerge is a model where there is only one right answer. To develop a thought about behavior analysis that yields only one right answer, the theory needs to be general and it needs to be measurable. What we are trying to do is to understand the impact of this understanding brought about by psychology and that is transforming the field of international relations in the US. Behavioralism and the change in the type of knowledge being produced is very important. This change will be coupled with another process, positivism. Positivism is a philosophical understanding that was born in the 19th century, strongly influenced by Kant and by the changes that the century goes through, in which there is a change in the relationship between faith and science. In the 19th century, it is a historical moment in which we can see a deconstruction of religious views and their power within European society. Religion loses much of its strength to create a social consensus on how men should guide their lives and how to generate purpose for your life and for your community. One fundamental thing has continued: the idea of the role of science as fundamental to understanding how society works. In the context of the post-second half of the 20th century, the aim is not to talk about how society should work. The goal is to adequately analyze the reality of society. This is contemporary positivism. Thus, the objective is not to change society, but to observe how it works. Here, positivism unfolds into four fundamental principles. Naturalism. It's the idea that there is only one science. Compared to classical realism, Kant and Morgenthau have two different conceptions of what science is. The ambiguity is dysfunctional for the purposes that this science project is intended to accomplish. The way to develop the social sciences is by copying the analysis models of the natural sciences, hence the idea of naturalism, based on chemistry, physics, and biology. Neutrality. If we only have one answer, if there is only one reality, it cannot depend on the observer perspective, ideological understandings, and political preferences. Your perspective cannot interfere with the reality of what is being observed. General laws. It is the idea that the only valid goal for science is generalization. We only have science if we can produce knowledge capable of recognizing the patterns that govern this scenario. For example, we only have the law of gravity if it works the same way everywhere. Another example is that it cannot be like the English school, where there is a dynamic of the international system for different times, such as the Middle Age or Cold War, and empirical verification. The only fundamental test of the validity of a theory is the empirical test. Considering these new ideas, what Kant and Morgenthau did was not science. The first argument to show the intellectual insufficiency of what is being proposed, regardless of whether it has valid elements that you can reflect on, is the idea of human nature. Why is human nature a problem? Because it is not observable, whereas behavior is observable. Most realist authors will explicitly resort to a reflection on human nature as the source of the premises of their theories. Realism is based on its diagnosis of human nature. In the English school, we also observe these types of specific diagnoses about human nature. They are all abstract principles. They can't be observed. We cannot have scientific knowledge based on premises that are not observable. If we make a science based on the analysis of behavior, it must be derived from observable elements of reality. Because of this, the idea of human nature must be eliminated from the reflection of realism. The second is the emphasis on history as the element for inferring laws to help us understand what is at stake from the point of view of political analysis. This is important because from a logical point of view, this is an inductive way of producing knowledge. It's a way of looking at the particular to understand the general. Thus, when we infer principles, they must be general. Regardless of the historical context, it must be deductive, from general to particular. Finally, we have the idea of a prescription. Classical authors seek to solve problems. They want to learn to prevent certain events from happening again and guide decision-making to provide stability in the international system. Thus, the criticism is that the objective of producing knowledge should not be to prevent a certain event from happening again. The goal must be to understand how a particular event works and not to intervene in it. That's all. Thanks for watching.